Yes, all right. So very good morning and welcome to all our panel speakers as well as attendees to our sixth webinar organized by Oxford Fajar, a subsidiary of Oxford University Press and the Malaysian English Language Teaching Association, MELTA. So I would like to thank all of you for being with us today. My name is Cheng Si from Oxford Fajar. So this webinar series is a collaboration between Oxford Fajar and MELTA, where we bring to you experts and classroom practitioners in the field of education to discuss pertinent topics relevant to teachers and educators. So for this webinar, Oxford Fajar would like to thank specifically the MELTA Perak chapter for inviting the speakers as well as the moderator for this session. So let's get started. I'm going to run through a few slides with you on some housekeeping. So before we start, so just to remind everyone that a certificate of participation will be given to all attendees within 7 working days via email. And this session will be recorded, so you can access the recorded session on both Oxford Fajar and MELTA websites and Facebook pages as well. So if you notice at the bottom of your screen, there is actually a Q&A button. So post your questions to the panelists and host in the Q&A session. So you can post this as and when any question that you have arises. We will also be launching some polls. So basically there'll be some questions that we have prepared and we will launch it. So just give us your feedback and then we want to see some of the responses here. So some of you are already using the chat function that we have. So feel free to put in your views and thoughts that you have, and the rest of the participants can see. So just remember that you are able to chat only to the panelists, or if you wanted to share to all participants, just put the drop-down button. So look at the drop-down button. All right, so I will now pass the time to Dr. Ramesh, who will be, he's actually the president of MELTA, who is also an associate professor at the Academy of Language Studies, University Technology Mara Insha Allah, Malaysia, to say a few words. So over to you, Dr. Ramesh, and have a great session, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cheng Si. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. The numbers are still going up. We are at 270 at the moment, and I'm sure this number will rise in the next few minutes. On behalf of the Malaysian English Language Teaching Association, I would like to welcome all of you to this 6th webinar in our Oxford Fajar MELTA webinar series. When we began the session, I'm sorry, I know that some of you are repeat visitors to our webinar series. I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, but just for the benefit of those who are here for the first time, let me just give a little overview on this webinar series. We began this series primarily because of the limitations that were impressed upon us as a result of the COVID-19. But as I was speaking to the panel members just now before we began, this has been in a way a blessing, in the sense that an online platform like this was not something we considered in the past, but this has really allowed us to bring in people from all over the world, as we can see here today, to have people from Algeria and Nepal and Uzbekistan, and of course we've had strong followings from the Philippines and Indonesia as well. So thank you all so much for making the time, and of course to all the Malaysian teachers who have been joining us over the last few webinars. Thank you, and I hope that our whole aim of running this webinar series is to provide teachers with an opportunity to share knowledge. And today I am especially thrilled to introduce, Yet Tang will be introducing the speakers, but to welcome Boni and Sital. Boni and I go back many years. We were friends in University Malaya back in the day, and it's not every day I get to introduce her to a large audience like this. So thank you so much, Boni, for agreeing to be part of this webinar series, and also to you, Sital. Sital is not a stranger to Malta. She has been, she was a participant in several Malta activities before she left for Australia. So thank you both. My thanks, of course, is also to Oxford Fajar for supporting this webinar series and making this a reality. I'd also like to thank the Malta Perak chapter for hosting this webinar, webinar 6. And I will now leave you in the good hands of Yetang, who is the Malta Perak chapter leader. Over to you, Yetang. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Associate Professor Dr. Ramesh Nair, the President of Malta, for the welcoming speech. Thank you to Chingzi Tu from Oxford Fajar for hosting this webinar. A very good morning to all of you from Ipoh, Perak, Malaysia. To our esteemed speakers this morning from Melbourne, we have Ms. Boni Nathan and Ms. Sital Kaur. I'm Yetang, the moderator for today's webinar. And thank you to all our viewers watching from all over Malaysia, as well as from the chat box. I can see from Indonesia, Melbourne, the Philippines, Oman, Uzbekistan, Nepal, Algeria, India, Ecuador, and perhaps some other places that I may have missed. So thank you for all of you for watching today's webinar. Our topic today is multi-layered engagement for EAL learners, the Australian experience. Now, as we know, in this 21st century, there has been a huge transformation in teaching English due to the ongoing refugee crisis and globalization of migration. Now, this often leads to frequent dilemmas faced by us teachers in choosing the right teaching pedagogy and methodology to ensure optimum engagement for English as an additional language, the EAL students. So this morning, our presentation will focus on the multi-layered pedagogy and methods used in the Australian EAL settings. Now, EAL students in Australia are a mixture of refugee, migrant, and international students. In this context, they continuously move along a continuum to arrive at a competent level, sometimes starting at non-existent English language knowledge. Now, does that sound familiar to us? When our students, for our students who start at non-existent English language knowledge. So we sincerely hope that our speakers' experience will be of interest to teachers who support low proficiency learners of English. So for those who are here with us this morning and you are teaching students with low level English proficiency, stay tuned with us. Stay with us till the end of today's webinar to take home some of the pedagogy and instructional strategies to engage our students in learning English. Now, I would like to introduce our esteemed speakers. Our first speaker is Ms. Boni Nathan. Boni, hi. Boni has
Hello.
a Master of Applied Linguistics from Edith Cowan University, Australia, a BEd TESOL with honours from University of Malaya, a graduate certificate in education for International Baccalaureate IB from University of Melbourne. She is currently part of the school leadership team as the EAL Learning Specialist and Curriculum Coordinator at a public school in Melbourne. Now, previously, she was a Deputy Principal at Teacher Consultant for Classroom Management and Students Engagement in Western Australia. Ms. Boni has worked as an EAL teacher for 33 years across multiple settings in international schools, colleges, universities, including Malaysian and Australian public schools. Now, having this vast experience in teaching EAL, I'm looking forward to learn from Miss Bonnie Nathan. Our second speaker today is Ms. Sital Kaur. Sital has a B.Ed TESOL with honors from Canterbury Christ Church University, United Kingdom. Currently, she's part of the school leadership team as the Literacy Improvement Leader and Year-Level EAL Coordinator at the public school in Melbourne. Before leaving for Melbourne, Sital was a District Master Level Trainer and Professional Learning Community, the PLC coach for Batang Padang District in Perak. Now, I think Sital's friends who are watching the webinar this morning are happy to see Sital online. Sital is also the recipient of the Perak State Education Department Gold Award. So these are our esteemed speakers for the webinar session today. But before I pass the time over to our speakers, I would like to remind our audience that you can share your views in the chat box. Feel free to let us know your thoughts. We also have the Q&A box. So if you have any questions to ask our speakers, write them down in the Q&A box. We may not be able to answer all the questions, but we will try our best to answer as many as we can. So I shall now pass the floor over to our first speaker this morning, Miss Bonnie Nathan. Bonnie, over to you.
Right, hi. Is that clear, first of all? Is the screen clear? Okay, cool. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are just going to share how we engage EAL students in Australia through a multi-layered approach. So if you see me looking that way, it's just because I've got two screens and my notes are on the other screen. And then I'll keep looking up and down. So we are hoping that what we share today will have some valuable ideas and resources that you could then take back and use in your context in wherever you are teaching. And as I can see, it's quite a bit of countries from around the world. So depending on your context, hopefully you can use some of that. So we are starting with the acknowledgement of the ownership of the Australian Indigenous people. So we would like to show our respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of elders past and present from which this meeting is taking place. So a lot has already been said about us, so I'm not going to say much. Yes, I've been teaching for 33 years and I'm still passionate about it. I still love teaching and that's why I'm still here. And I have taught in Malaysia and in Australia now for about 15 years.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm Sital Kaur and I've been teaching for the past 7 years, teaching EAL in both Malaysia and Australia contexts. And I'm very glad to be part of Melta this year, as Melta has always been close to my heart. So as mentioned by Dr. Ramesh earlier, I've been involved ever since I was a student back in college as a volunteer. And then in year 2016, I was given the opportunity to present my lesson methods on literature in Malta conference, in which I received a silver award. So here I am again on this beautiful morning to share my knowledge and experience with all of you. Okay, so our presentation this morning is divided into 3 parts, comprising of the Australian EAL structure, the pedagogy, and the impact on student learning. So this structure will further break down the background and curriculum to better understand some of our approaches for the teaching and learning of EAL in Australia. And it's important to note that in Australia, we have 2 different EAL settings. So first is the English language schools and centers, and the second setting is EAL in the mainstream context. Okay, in Australia, the term used is EAL, which stands for English as an Additional Language. So the reason behind this is students are learning English as an additional language because they are already fluent in more than one language. So taking that into consideration, the term EAL has been embedded into the Australian curriculum to help teachers plan their lessons. And this term EAL, it also raises awareness that students are learning a language in the language they are learning. Therefore, it indirectly creates empathy towards the learner, and it makes teaching and learning becomes less stressful. In many states and territories, the term EAL/D is used as it includes the dialects of our Aboriginal students.
So as you can see on the slide that we've got a picture of that brain, and we can see from there that all languages are processed in the same part of the brain. So when we learn more than one language, then the brain uses all these languages to process and expand our linguistic capacity. In the Victorian EAL curriculum now, they've added the term plurilingualism, which tells us how to gauge how students transfer their cultural knowledge from their home language to English. So this allows teachers to further understand that the students are learning English as an additional language. And looking at the teaching of phonics, as most home languages have very limited vowel sounds, students need explicit teaching of synthetic phonics. So because in English you have about 20 vowel sounds. So the term EAL quickly reminds the teacher that there is this gap. There's a bigger gap between multiple languages when they're teaching sounds, and it is an additional language that they are learning. Last but not least, the term EAL encourages teachers to plan activities to make sure that students have a bit of safety and accountability when they are in the classroom. So for example, when the question is posed to students, they are given this wait time or the think time before they can try and answer questions. And we will look at this a little further when we discuss instructional strategies. We need to keep in mind that complications arise when, depending on the country where this language is taught, because for refugee students, wherever the United Nations sends them, that's the language they have to learn. So for example, if they're sent to Germany, they have to learn German and English. So further things will be complicated this way. So we just thought we'll just take a minute and respond to a poll here. And the question we want to ask you is, do you think Malaysia should move away from that ESL label? So there's a poll coming up, so you just have to click yes, no, or maybe. Yeah. Can we move on, or are people still voting there? Yeah. Right. So once they're still voting. All right. We will go. Yeah, we'll go back to the poll in a minute. And once you've done the poll, think about this next question. Why do you think? If you have said yes, why do you think yes? If you have said no, why no? And if you can share that thought in the chat box, what your reason is for making the choice. There's some very interesting thoughts coming here. The poll says there's a bigger amount of people saying no, some are unsure. 45% have said no so far, and 30% have said yes. And some of the reasons that I can see that are coming in the chat are, let me see, I'm trying to see whether, yeah, there it is. Okay. So some people have said no because ESL does not fit all of us. And some people have said multilingualism is important. The situation in Malaysia is different from Australia because English is second language in Malaysia. That's some of the opinions that have come up. Let's see as we move along today, if you think you may even change your mind on that. So we're going to move along and all right. So the Australian EAL background is made up, as you were told earlier, of refugee, migrant, and international students. So refugee students sometimes have missed more than 4 years of their schooling life. So we are not just teaching a language, but also teaching them how to be a student, how to be at school. And the time frame is very different in different states. So for example, in Victoria, they get 12 months in the language centers. In South Australia, they get 24 months. In Western Australia, they'll get 18 months. Some of these students have never been to secondary schools. They've only had minimal primary education. So when they come to us, we have to deal and overcome the refugee trauma through behavior management strategies to get them ready to learn. This also includes non-refugee students, which like in Malaysia as well, who may have problems at home, neglect, lack of positive parenting, teenagers with teenage issues, because when they are not ready to learn, they can't actually learn. And in transition countries, including Malaysia, they do not allow these refugee students to attend public schools. So they are they further lose all that learning time. And then we've got migrant and international students who it is compulsory for them to do 6 months in a language center before they're allowed to move to a mainstream classroom.
Okay, so once students have finished the required time in the language center, they then join the mainstream school. And once again, it's important to note that these EAL students join non-EAL students for all subjects but English. So for English, there are 2 categories in the mainstream school. So one is called English and the other one is EAL. So they are considered as EAL learners until they have lived in Australia for a certain number of years. And once again, this depends on the state where they live. So for the state of Victoria, once students have lived in the country for 7 years, they then join mainstream classes for all subjects. And teachers are aware of these EAL students in their classes because subject teachers in all areas are expected to differentiate lessons for EAL students. And when we move into the impact section, I will give you an example of how teachers from other subjects differentiate their lessons and resources to better suit these EAL learners. And even in EL classes, differentiation is highly recommended. So students are streamed based on their abilities just to ensure that they gain the most out of their schooling years. And as mentioned earlier by Bonnie, we have students coming from all sorts of schooling experiences. So by streaming students, EL teachers can really address their specific problems. And it's quite difficult to differentiate lessons when you have A, students who can write competently, and B, students who can hardly construct a simple sentence. But having said that, thoughts are also put in to ensure that amongst those low achievers, there are some high achievers in the group to allow for peer motivation, as recommended by Hattie.
So we are looking at class sizes in Australia at the moment. In language centers, we have a minimum of 4 students and a maximum of 15. We may add 2 more to 17, but that's it. In a mainstream EAL class, you have a minimum of 8 and a maximum of 15. And in a mainstream class, you have minimum of 15 and a maximum of 25 students. So there is a lot of funding for new arrivals, mostly refugee students, and they're provided with many types of government funding for their educational needs. So there is money for more classrooms and the hiring of more teachers. The national average for public schools in Malaysia, the student to teacher ratio is actually 16:1. So that's approximately 16:1. However, these numbers are determined by the state and territory teacher unions when they sign agreements with the State Department of Education. So they think about things like student, teacher workload, contact time with students, meetings, timetabling issues, all of this. And unions actually fight really hard for to lessen teacher workload. So you can see that's why we have these smaller classes. EAL classrooms are usually half the size of mainstream classrooms because then, like I said, we have enough funding to allow that extra small group and one-on-one interactions. So I'm just going to take a small pause here and have a quick discussion, and feel free to type in the chat on class sizes in Malaysia compared to Australia and see how we feel about this. I'm just going to look at the chat and see if something's come up, if anyone has said anything about this.
It will also be interesting to know about other countries besides Malaysia, because we have participants all over the world. So
thank you, Sital. I forgot that. Yes.
So what's roughly your minimum number and maximum number, just so that we get a rough idea of how different countries, how the class sizes are in different countries.
Yeah. So we've got Manila, Indonesia, Philippines, Uzbekistan, Nepal, India.
Wow, roughly.
Wow, 30 to 50 students. 40 to 50. Philippines, 60.
60. That's
wow,
amazing.
Nepal, 40 to 50. Okay. That is really interesting. In Australia, behavior management is a very big issue as well. Most of our teachers within first 5 years of becoming teachers actually leave the profession because they can't manage their classrooms. And a part of these numbers is due to that study as well. So I think in some of your countries, I don't know, how do you deal with behavior issues if you have 50 students in the class? Maybe you can share that.
Sorry, someone has just asked in the chat box if you're referring to public school. Yes, this class size is, and also our presentation is based on our experience teaching in public schools.
Yeah. Public schools in the Philippines have 50 to 60, showing true love with our students. That's really interesting. Right, so we're going to move on a little bit and then we'll come back to the chat in a while. So let's look at the next one. Yeah.
Okay, as we can see in the graph, it's very obvious that the new arrival students have very low proficiency in English. So it's about 90%. And in the language centers, most of the students are low proficient English language users, and they may reach an intermediate level just before they exit into the mainstream setting. And this links to the point mentioned earlier about streaming students based on their proficiency, so that differentiation strategy takes place effectively, just to reduce the number of low proficient learners as they move into mainstream EAL classroom. And once these students come to mainstream classes, we have about 40% of low proficiency learners. And to provide extra support for those learners, an extra English language lesson, about 3 periods a week, is offered as an elective subject. So this is to further reduce the percentage of low proficiency learners as they transit into mainstream classes or when they exit secondary school. So this elective subject is timetable, and the lessons cover grammar and all skills, mostly oral skills.
So when we look at assessment in Australia, so the language center students do not sit for any national exams. And our focus for language is because most of our new arrivals at the language center schools begin with 0 English. So we start with survival English so that they then have an opportunity to visit the doctor, they can go shopping, and they can use this survival English in their daily lives from the get-go. So when it comes to assessment, we then do ongoing formative assessments that aligns with the new Victorian EAL curriculum, which uses a clear and evidence-based EAL developmental continuum. So this allows us for systematic and standardized moderation. Our focus of curriculum is on genre, because genre is a transferable skill, and EAL students may not be able to transfer all their new language skills, but they will be able to transfer knowledge of the structure, for example, or features of a report, a biography, for example. So what we have done is to increase transparency and visibility of our student learning and to increase evidence-based moderation and assessment processes.
So in the mainstream setting, students are tested in both primary and secondary schools. So in primary schools, where we call them year 1s to year 6, which is equivalent to standard 1 to standard 6 in Malaysia, and junior schools from year 7 to 9, which is from 1 to form 3 in Malaysia, students sit for NAPLAN test. NAPLAN stands for National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy. So not every year. So they start this in year 3, and then in year 5, year 7, and year 9. So this test is a measuring tool for teachers to specifically gauge students' levels in literacy and numeracy skills. So no other areas are tested besides these two. So literacy covers reading, writing, grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Point to note, this testing is entirely optional, whereby parents can choose for their kids to not sit for the exam. So no students are affected by their decision to not partake in this test. So the results from these exams, this testing, are used by the Department of Education to provide fundings for schools. So fundings are inversely proportional to the results, NAPLAN results, whereby the lower your scores are, the higher the funding gets. So students get one-to-one support outside classroom and sometimes in the classroom based on the fundings, all with the idea of helping to improve students' basic literacy and numeracy skills. So that is for primary and junior school. So once students go into senior school, which is year 10 onwards, and that is Form 5 equivalent in Malaysia, they sit for Victoria's Certificate of Education examination. So that covers year 11 and year 12 syllabus. So year 12 is equivalent to Form 6. So for VCE, there are 2 core subjects, English or English literature and maths. And then students get to pick other 4 elective subjects. And again, not all students sit for VCE examination. So in year 10, students who are not highly academic, they are recommended to do VCAL. VCAL stands for Victorian Certificate of Applied Learning, which is a hands-on option for students in years 11 and 12. It's designed to prepare students for training or employment by providing them with work-related experience, literacy, basic literacy, numeracy skills, and an opportunity to develop personal skills. So that's about the national exams. Moving on to focus. So the focus for all year levels is on language, literature, and literacy skills, which I will explain more in the curriculum and pedagogy section. In terms of assessment, students are required to sit for termly formative and summative assessments. So we have mid-year examination, end-of-year examination, and national exams as mentioned before. The curriculum is genre-based, and we will discuss this further in the next slide.
Yeah, before moving on, I'm just looking at some of these quite interesting comments on the chat box, and someone has said they really like the term survival English more. It takes away that exam focus. And someone else has said that they like the idea of funding being needs-based rather than funding for any other purpose. And I think, yeah, that's true. So when the funding becomes needs-based, depending on the schools, the context, so we actually then can get more done. Correct. Yeah, that's true. So in the language center, moving on, in the language center, we group our students into literacy, beginner, post-beginner, and intermediate. So we have a lot of autonomy on what we teach, guided by the EAL curriculum. So this gives us the opportunity to create a curriculum based on our student needs and context. So when students first arrive, like I said, the focus is on survival English. And in Australia, we have found that the thematic or topic-based approach creates the highest level of EAL student engagement and learning, because it allows for the recycling of language, and it allows you to have displays in the classroom so that the language is recycled for a whole term. So we then create topics and assessment rubrics based on what is best suited for our students according to their levels. So our topics would be easy to more complex. So for example, in a student who are in literacy, we may be talking about fruits and colors. And then when they reach intermediate level, we may start going into ancient China. So we are looking at things like text analysis when they move on to intermediate, because then they are going on to high school where they will be doing a lot more of this. It allows teachers to see what their students have done before they come into their class, because the topics are all recorded somewhere, and the teachers can see how they have moved along. And we also use the assessment rubrics to inform our planning, our moderation, and our reporting. Again, different states in Australia do different types of continuums to suit their needs. Even within a state, for example, in Victoria, different schools can still create different curriculums to suit their context, because the Australian curriculum is fluid, it's not prescriptive, and it allows space for this so that it's more contextualized.
Okay, so following on from that, at the school where I work, so in the mainstream EAL context, each term a new text is taught for students to be able to complete these genres. So there are 4 terms in an academic year. So in term 1, students read a play and then write an analytical text response to it. In term 2, students will then read short stories and write a creative response by adopting one of the characters' perspectives. In term 3, students write a comparative analysis by comparing a film to text. And in term 4, students are required to do research and present an oral presentation. The narrative genre is not accessed in senior schools, but in primary and junior school. The curriculum seems very demanding for EAL students. And when I first moved here and found out about this structure, I was perplexed as to how these EAL students are able to learn so much in less time. However, the strategies and approaches we have put in place for the planning and execution of these lessons have somehow made all these tasks achievable and doable. So the rationale behind exposing students to different genres and different skill type assessments is to develop literate individuals who are capable of critical and creative thinking, as well as to enhance the aesthetic appreciation. And this exposure has also proven to develop students' ability to create and analyze text, moving away from just superficial understanding to deeper interpretation and critical analysis. So in other words, development from lower order to higher order thinking skills.
All right. So we're going to just take a pause for a minute before we move on to the next session. We wanted to say, I was looking at the Q&A. At this point, there aren't any questions that have been actually directed at us. So if you want to take a minute and you have any questions before we move on to the next section, I'll maybe for about 10 seconds. If there are no questions, then we will just move on. But I've been looking at some of the comments on the chat, and people, Melvin, I think, you have said that you like the idea of, less focus on score and more focus on the funding. And yes, I agree with that, because funding is quite important, and governments putting an important, the importance on education being, a focus is quite important. And someone has said different genres generate higher thinking order skills. Correct. And we will be talking about that later. Yeah. All right. There's someone who said, please show the slides. Does that mean you can't see the slides? I'm not sure what's going on there. So we're going to move on to the next section, because we are also mindful of the time, and we are mindful that it's a Saturday for you guys. So let's keep moving unless something, oh, I can see some questions on the Q&A. Should I address that now?
Yes, please do.
Okay. No, none of this. Someone has asked, how many hours of English do the students get in a day or week?
Okay. So in the mainstream context, one period is 75 minutes and we have 4 periods a week. So 75 minutes each period and 4 periods a week. And there's also a question in the chat box to Seetal. What is it that you mentioned was being taught in terms 3 and 4? Okay, so term 3 is a comparative analysis, whereby we get students to watch a film and then they read a text, and then they compare the elements, the themes, the issues, concerns in both those texts, so film and the novel. So it's moving one step further. So in term 1 is just analysis on one text. And then in term 3, they would then consolidate on that by comparing 2 texts. So one is a film, one is a written text. And then in term 4, it's oral presentation. So students are given with the current issue, any current issue that's happening at that point of time. And they are required to do research to find out information about that issue. And they have to then present by adopting a persona. so present their views on that issue.
All right. There is a very interesting question on the Q&A. It talks about somebody wanted to know what are the types of teacher support that we get in Australia and whether it's different to Malaysia. And I think that's a really interesting question. So what happens here is when teachers first come out, so when they first come out of uni, they are known as graduate teachers for the first 5 years. But in the first 2 years, there is extra funding put in place, and they are then paired with a mentor teacher who will help them through their first 2 years of working as teachers. So a mentor teacher is someone who will go into their classroom, observe them, give them feedback. They can go and observe the mentor teacher, and they'll go through a process, because when they first come out, the licensing is provisional. So they are provisionally registered. And then after these 2 years, they'll go through a process to be a fully registered teacher, and they have to pass this process. So the mentor teacher will make sure or help them to get past that hurdle. So there's a lot of support given to new teachers in Australia. There's funding for that. There's extra professional learning for them, and those kind of things happen. So if you're an experienced teacher, then you can then put up your hand to be a mentor teacher, and you also get special training to become a mentor teacher for those teachers. So I hope that answers. And then there are some questions here that we will be soon talking about in the next part of the presentation. So I will leave you at this for now, and then we will talk about what we're going to be talking about next. So let me just get that first. So what we are moving on now is actually that now that you have a bit of a clearer idea of the pedagogy and the curriculum of both settings in Australia, we're going into a bit more detailed information on the pedagogy and support that we provide for EAL students here. So firstly, let's look at the medium of instruction. So we need to remember, and this is true in Malaysia, in anywhere in the world, for all the people around the world that come to join this webinar, EAL students are learning a language in the language they are learning. And that English is taught through English by a teacher who is monolingual or who is expected to act as if he or she is monolingual. So in Australia, the medium of instruction, the continuous learning and usage of L1 or home language and using the hooks to learn the new language, in this instance English, is highly recommended and emphasized. We recommend that parents keep using their home language, as research shows that the more competent students are in the home language, it is easier for them to learn a new language, again thinking about the way the brain processes languages. So we have MEAs, or multicultural aids, are employed on the based on the majority of language need in a place, in a center. So it might be Arabic, Turkish, Vietnamese, Burmese, so depending on what we need. We also use many forms of translation, Google Translate, and dictionaries. Our students have access to iPads, laptops, and in the Language Center, we actually can request for students to use their mobile phones. As you may already know, mobile phones were recently banned during school hours in Australia, including lunch and recess. So we have to actually request for that to be used during our class time. We also use many other creative ways to make teaching comprehensible, knowingly or unknowingly, using research by Chris Crescent, Michael Long, etc. So now looking at language acquisition. So when they're learning their first language, let's think about our children, our nephews, our nieces. They are the age of 0 to 5. They are in a familiar environment. They have very low demand on their time. They have many models, adults who are parents, uncles, aunties, grandparents. They have a high level of motivation because they need to fulfill personal needs. And the input is adjusted or child-directed, is caretaker taught. So for example, if your child says to you, I eat apple yesterday, you will say, oh, you ate an apple yesterday, and you just leave it at that. But when you come to that second or additional language acquisition, it is happening at any age. The students are in a new and unfamiliar and unpredictable situation. Therefore, they lack confidence to even try. The demand on their time is very high. So for example, we might only get 12 months with our students before they go into mainstream, or they may have an exam that they need to do in a certain number of time. They don't have many models because they don't have familiar people around them. Their relationships with the teacher is quite unclear. They have limited access to L1 models at school. So they use, so for example, that's why we have those multicultural aides to come and help us. Their motivation is low. What is the reason? So my students have 4 or 5 languages and they are now being forced, because they are refugees and they've been put into a country, forced to learn English. And in Malaysia or in anywhere in the world that you are talking about, think about what kind of motivation your student need to learn English. It could be for job, it could be for going to uni, it could be any reason. And you need to make that connection with their life after school in order for them to have that motivation. And the input for second or additional language is, it is not understood by the learner. It could be foreigner talk, it could be teacher talk. So when your student says, yesterday I eat apple, you may say, no, you have to say, yesterday I ate an apple. So you might start correcting it straight away. So these kind of things are something that we need to be aware of while we're in the class. So we use many instructional strategies out there. We have chosen a few, and because we are mindful of time, we are not going to go through all of them. We are just going to go through one each. So some of the strategies that we use here are to help the students connect their L1 to their L2. So these strategies actually help students participate in their learning instead of just sitting and listening like in a lecture style. So whenever we do these strategies, we always say spelling does not matter. We want students to have flow of thought, and we create an atmosphere of balance between safety and accountability. And we highly, highly recommend that teacher talk is only about 20% of the lesson time. So I'm going to quickly explain just what a jigsaw would look like, and Seetal will explain something else in a minute. So in a jigsaw, you can see that students are divided into groups using color. You can use colored paper, pop sticks, any of those. And then each group will have a member of each color. And then they are given a question or a topic of discussion, and then they will go out of their group and join their own color. And then they will have this discussion. So these are known as the expert groups. And then they bring this discussion back to their groups. They come back and join as multicolored. And this way, you can see that they're bringing ideas from elsewhere. So it creates a bit of safety for the students. And this is a very effective activity to be used in the we do section of a lesson. Okay. And Seetal may talk about something else, one of them.
So I will take you through the think, pair, share activity, which I think it's familiar to all of us. So this is a 3-step collaborative learning strategy where students work together to solve a problem or answer a question. So this strategy requires students to, number 1, think individually about a topic or answer to question. Number 2, share ideas with their partners. And then number 3, share it with the classmates. Without realizing, there is actually a lot of implicit oral practice happening in this strategy. And because of that, it encourages a high degree of student response as opposed to a teacher asking a question and one student responding. So it indirectly helps increase student engagement in learning. I use it a lot at the start of new reading texts. I love to post questions. For example, in year 10, students do a play titled 12 Angry Men, which is about the jury system in the US. So my thinking questions would be, how is the legal system in your country? Does the judge decide the verdict or members of the jury? And because I have students from different parts of the world, it's good to see them sharing information about their respective countries and how fascinating the discussion gets. So that's the beauty about these learners. They share their findings, they share their experiences, knowledge about their respective countries. And this is by far my favorite strategy because from my observation, I've seen growth in my low achievers' proficiency level. And this strategy has directly helped them to be more confident. And I was just responding to one of the questions in the chat, whereby someone asked, how do we increase student confidence? And I was just responding to that. This is one of the ways where I've seen by applying this strategy, this has indirectly made my students more confident because they have had the chance to discuss with their partners first. It's not about what I think, rather it's about what we think. So it's a group activity. So students are more willing to take risk and try. And one point I realized is that with low learners, I have to be extra sensitive to their needs. For instance, their reading skills, their attentional skills, their language skills, when I'm creating pairs. So of course, I won't be pairing two students who are at a very low level. Otherwise, the discussion might not take place. And another point to note, I've seen difference in students' participation when I give them the opportunity to choose who will share or present the discussion to the whole class. So I never really paid much attention to this when I was a teacher in Malaysia, as I would normally pick the presenter. And I would normally go to pick those who are very passive, who haven't really contributed much. But when I decided to change my approach here, I was surprised with the outcome of it. It might sound trivial, but it actually indirectly affects their participation, because we have to keep in mind that English is neither their first nor second language. So some students are only comfortable speaking in smaller groups, and they are shy to speak to a bigger group. So when we respect and acknowledge that fact, when we take away the pressure from them, when we create a learning space that is safe and comfortable, these learners feel valued and they will be indirectly engaged in those lessons.
Yeah.
Okay, so I hope I've answered some of your questions, because there were some of you asking about ways to improve student confidence. So that's one of the ways where we can apply.
All right.
Moving on, as you can see on your screen, this is the teaching and learning cycle, which is used all over Australia in both contexts, in the English language centers as well as the mainstream context. So it involves 4 key stages, which incorporate social support for all the 4 macro skills. And it helps to scaffold students' language learning in a variety of texts. So this learning cycle allows teachers to extend literacy skills and carefully strategize activities so that students can move between reading and writing, and at the same time involve them in speaking and listening experiences. So since this cycle is continuous, we can start anywhere and end anywhere. So I'll now explain this cycle in terms of a writing activity, looking at a sample lesson plan. So we will look at a sample lesson plan. Okay. So on your screen is a sample of explicit instructional model, which I'll refer to as EIM. So this is our lesson plan. And we will now see how it links to the teaching and learning cycle shown in the previous slide. So the first stage in the cycle is building the field or setting the context, is where we will deliver the content that is required for the students to successfully support literacy in a particular genre. So in our EIM, this happens at the beginning of the lesson. So in this stage, we make links to students' prior knowledge and support these learners to connect to the new content that they will be learning. The next stage in the cycle is the modeling or deconstruction stage, where we provide our learners with the model text that we want them to produce in the independent practice. So in our EIM, this happens in the presentation phase, and it's called the I do stage, because the teacher does most of the talking and doing in this stage, in this phase. So this is a crucial phase for investigating the types of academic language that is needed to successfully write a response in. So teacher is providing as much input as possible for the students so that they can use that to produce the outcome that we want. And moving on, the next stage in the learning cycle, teaching and learning cycle, which is the joint construction, is a stage where we work with the EAL learners to develop a sample of what we want them to produce in the final stage. So in the EIM, this happens in the guided practice space, and it's called the we do stage. So right now, a teacher will slowly shift the responsibility onto students. So it's of a shared responsibility. So teachers may ask learners lots of directed questions that would enhance their understanding of writing a model answer. Because the key at this stage is to extract information from students rather than give or feed them. And the final stage is where learners put into practice everything that has come from previous stages of the writing process. So the independent practice stage is where teachers give learners a similar question or response that they want them to create, having used all of the teaching and learning that has come from previous stages. So this is now the you do stage, whereby the responsibility has shifted entirely onto the students, and the teacher's role is now as a facilitator. So a point to note that we only move to this stage once we feel that students are able to complete the task independently. So if students are still unsure, we might go back to the presentation point if the need is there to give extra input. And then finally, teacher brings the lesson to an appropriate conclusion by reviewing the key points and tying them together into a coherent whole. Also, differentiation is recommended all throughout the 4 stages. And this model, and EIM, it helps teachers to differentiate through shorter, simpler instructions for less proficient learners, and in terms of support, whereby low proficient learners are supported by reducing the number of tasks or questions that they have to complete, and the high proficient learners are extended through more challenging tasks. So time, teacher assistance, and resources for completing tasks vary accordingly to learner proficiency. Okay, and in terms of functional grammar, this is also not taught in isolation, but it is taught in context. And we will now show you an example of how we do this in the next few slides.
So in Australia, grammar is not taught in isolation, it's taught in context. So we use this register continuum because basically what we are doing is we are moving students from that informal, everyday, more spoken-like language towards the more highly technical and formal written form. So I'll show you an example. So this is an example of a sentence written by an EAL student. Yesterday when the bell rang, we lined up at the door. So obviously it's a primary school student's example. And then we talk about how we can add details to that using all this stuff. When they are very low level, we don't use the terms pointer, numerative, intensive. We just ask WH questions. Who did that? What did they do? What were they wearing? What color? So we just add this stuff, make it a little bit more simpler. So basically what we are doing is we are expanding a sentence using the noun group. So we focus on the door and then we expand that using describing the door, classifying the door, qualifiers, so additional information. And then we end up with a sentence that is a little bit more complex. So yesterday when the bell rang, we lined up at the tall red wooden door next to the garden. And as the EAL students progress in their language learning, this becomes the new norm. They begin to write more. So this happens slowly and in context. So our core to teaching is Bloom's taxonomy. So starting with lesson planning, we incorporate that gradual release model that Sital was talking about. Then we ensure there's differentiation. We use that E5 model is embedded in our planning to support our EAL learners. And then we make sure this kind of model provides more equity and we are being more inclusive. Then we add over various instructional strategies in this mix like we've looked at. And then we recognize that there are different types of learners. So these strategies allows the different types of learners also to now start engaging in the lesson. So before we move on, we just thought we'll take a pause, and I'm looking at this question, 2 questions that I've seen in the chat and in the Q&A. So Mohammed Aizat, you've asked, a genre-based curriculum, how does that help with the non-English language speakers, and how will that affect the Malaysian, how can that be used in the Malaysian setting? So basically from our research and research around the world, they found that when you focus actually on the genre, so even the non-EAL student, we don't go we again use that continuum. We start with the informal and we move to the formal. So when we use the genre for the whole term, so for example, with very low proficiency learners, let's say I'm using a genre about description. So I might just choose to describe fruits, for example. So, and then I will teach them how to use adjectives. I will say this is an apple or this is a red apple. And that's how we just build on that existing knowledge that they bring. And a lot of our students, like we said, they have multiple languages in their brain. We use what they already know and then we build on that. So that's what we do. Hopefully that sort of answers. And then there was another question in the chat that talked about reading and comprehension. How do, there are very good readers out there, but they cannot comprehend. And this is a very interesting question because we find a lot of students who have come from Asia, especially international students from Asia, read extremely well. They look like they're very competent readers, but they're unable to answer any inferential questions. They're very good at direct questions, but if you ask them to do thinking questions, what do you think happened? Why do you think he did this? They find that really, really difficult because they have been taught to read just what they are reading. So here in our reading, and that's actually a whole new webinar on that you'll have to do on reading, we have multiple types of strategies to address those needs, to get students not only to be able to read, but to apply knowledge of that reading to answering questions, to comprehend what they are reading. So there's a lot of strategies for that as well. Are there any other questions that we need to answer, Sita? Is there something or?
Yeah, I would like to address a question posed by Nur Aida, whereby she asked how many hours is set for the particular lesson plan that was shown, the writing lesson plan. So it really depends on your student's level, because it may be completed in one period, it may stretch up to 2 periods. But just remember, be mindful that you can only move to independent stage once you feel that students can complete the task autonomously. Because it's very important in the guided practice stage, if we feel that students have acquired the basic skills required for them to complete the task, then we can entirely shift the responsibility onto them. So it's important to create that sort of environment before actually getting them to do the task. So it comes back to how your students are able to cope with it, the level of your students.
Okay. There is a really good question by Christine. She says, how do we deal with students who are shy, slow learners, and have problems in interacting with other students? And that's actually a really good question, because in our students, we have introverts who do not want to work with other students, and we do understand that, and we do take that into consideration. So in our classroom, we actually give them a choice. So if you want, you can actually work on your own. And also Farida has said, in order to implement EIM, students must have a certain level of proficiency. This product of the writing will be chaotic. Actually, the EIM doesn't happen in one lesson. In my language center, we take a whole week to do one EIM. So it's very, very slowly done. So it actually can be done. So we might only do one part of the EIM on Monday, and then we continue. And by Friday, we will have students who are able to write something individually. So that's what we do. And that's one really good question before we move on. We don't have much to go on, so we'll just get this one. What are the challenges that you face thus far? What are the how do you know how we need to take into consideration when teaching multilingual students? Yes, so when we are teaching multilingual students, like what we are doing here, basically that's why we use all these strategies. We use genre, we use instructional strategies, we use EIM. Basically, the teacher needs to be very, very aware, not of what they are teaching, but what their students are learning. So the focus is on the learner. The focus is on what's happening outside in the classroom, not what's happening in how you are doing the work. So there's lots of multiple strategies and lots of learning that we do. We are continuously learning. So we never stop. We have continuously a professional development that we do almost on a weekly basis sometimes in our meetings. And if somebody has something new, we share, we try, and we keep on going. Sital, do you have anything that you want to, is there anything there?
There's one more question by Kanti Mati. What about students who are weak, paired with good students, but not interested to learn at all? How do we help them? Okay, this comes back to the point of streaming students based on their abilities, because like what I mentioned, it's impossible to get students to contribute to a group discussion if they are very weak and they've got some really strong students in that group. So it's difficult to get them to speak. But if you have students who are slightly lower, like let's say they are weak, but then you have slightly stronger, not to the other extreme, but they are challenging as well. So that might influence this weaker group to also speak up, because they won't feel shy, they won't feel they won't feel embarrassed to speak. But yes, when you have a class whereby you have very good students who can read, write, speak competently, at the same time you have the other extreme, so group of students who can hardly construct sentences, who can hardly write without making any errors, then it is a big challenge. So it's good to make sure that it's your classroom is not of that extreme, but you have some sort of difference in abilities.
The other thing to remember is there is a big difference between group work and collaborative or cooperative learning. In group work, you're basically grouping the students and you're giving them something to do, and that's it. And therefore, the A student will do all the work because they still want the A, and the lazy student will sit back and do nothing. But in a cooperative learning situation, you have actually given each student a role, and if that role is not fulfilled, that work cannot be completed. So if you have a really weak student who can't actually read or write, that student can then be the presenter, or that student can actually stand up and just hold the presentation while the other students read it. So in that way, you actually are engaging that student as well. So thinking about this not as group work, but as cooperative learning is very, very important. We're going to move on because time is running out, and we just have a few more to cover, and then we'll go back to some questions.
Yeah.
So we're just going to quickly look at some of the impact that we've had, some positive impact that we've had with these multi-layered engagement strategies that, that our EAL students, the impact it's had on our EAL students here. So, so we're just looking at this, and we'll just run through this quite quickly because I can see your time.
So through the E5 instructional model, we have seen how students engage in small groups to extend their knowledge and skills. So this could be a good model for you to try with your weaker, shy students who might not want to, who are reluctant to try. So give it a go, because when we use this in our lessons, for oral lessons, we see that this model actually facilitates deeper and more meaningful conversations. And at the same time, it develops metacognitive capacities. So in terms of reading and writing, through peer feedback, there's a lot of opportunity for self-reflection and self-assessment, especially when they evaluate their work against their peers' works. And this E5 instructional model also cultivates higher order thinking skills across all 4 macro skills. And next, by using the EIM, the explicit instructional model, it has actually allowed us teachers to plan and reflect on high impact teaching and learning strategies, known as HITS. And it has also helped us to design specific and focused learning intentions and success criteria to meet students' needs. And most importantly, with this EIM, it helps to reduce teacher talking time and increase student talking time.
Right. So in the instructional strategies, they, and as you have seen, they encompass cooperative and collaborative learning. And somebody asked, what is the difference? The difference is in how you set up and what is it that you want. So a collaborative learning might be 2 students writing the same piece of work. But in a cooperative learning, they all work together, but they are going to produce individual work, for example. So what we want is for students to be more engaged, more students to be more engaged more of the time. So you may never ever get 100% engagement in a classroom, but an 85% and above is already quite good. So when we use instructional strategies, what we see students interacting better with their peers. We are creating more safety and accountability in the classroom. We're giving students opportunity to highlight their prior knowledge from their other languages that they bring. We are giving them chance to demonstrate comprehension, and we're allowing students to gain ideas through sharing sessions and take risks in their writing. In the gradual release model, it helps the teachers actually, what is the purpose of their teaching? What is the planning? How can they be more explicit? It actually gives them that idea on how to do that. So teachers are actually more clear on what's happening at every point in the lesson. So it increases student motivation, it gives them more confidence, it offers differing levels of support as we go through the model within a week, maybe a day, depending on your student. It increases autonomy of students, and they are also willing to take more risks. And then, as we've seen, grammar, we are not teaching them as a separate entity. It is taught in context. And if you look at Crescen's research, he says there is a rhythm and continuum on how EAL students learn grammar, no matter how you teach it. So they're going to learn it the way they will learn. So we have many international and migrant students who have had grammar taught to them in isolation through rote learning. So what we see is, although they might do well in a test, they're unable generally to apply their knowledge to a new setting or context. So functional grammar comes in and helps with this. So for example, it gives them higher fluency, higher grammatical accuracy. It makes them more aware of nominalization. They have higher level of comprehension. It creates awareness of genre features and structures, helps with sentence expansion, and so on. So in the Language Center, we have said, we are now coming to almost the end. So hang in there. So we're going to talk about immersion. So in the Language Center, we recommend home language is maintained. We have said this many, many times. The brain uses all these languages to learn. So when they are more competent, they're able to translate and transfer that knowledge into new learning. We use cross-curricular method. So for example, if my topic is food, then I may add on a humanities topic such as environmental issue, or a health topic such as junk food, or a history of certain food, and so on. So in the Australian curriculum now, the EAL curriculum, they've added this term plurilingualism. So they have said our EAL learners are plurilingual because they have multiple language in their brain, and they're able to use this to enrich their learning. So then they come to class. So we are now aware, our students come to class with prior knowledge of how a language works, meta-linguistic skills, and different ways of perceiving the world.
Okay. So as mentioned earlier in the structure, in the mainstream setting, EAL learners are put in the same class as non-EAL learners for all subjects except English. So therefore, immersion is maximized. So students get another reason to learn the language, because if they don't, they will not be able to achieve success in all other subjects. And as we discussed earlier, teachers are expected to differentiate. So I'll share with you an example from the food studies subject. So because teachers are aware that students might not be familiar to certain ingredients, to help students understand the ingredients, teachers use visuals, realia, and sometimes translation. And I would also like to share my experience before I moved here. So I only knew one type of pasta, which is the spaghetti. I didn't know there were different types of pasta. You have penne, fettuccine, tortellini, ravioli, and many more. Let's not get there. So imagine how would these EAL learners feel when they realize that there is so much more in this setting compared to their home country. So that is why it's very, very important for teachers to differentiate for the learners. And keeping that in mind, so each subject ensures that each teachers ensure that they do not let this challenge impede the EAL students' performance. And living in Australia as opposed to Malaysia, where everyone is multilingual. So the common language in Malaysia is Malay. and that is a comparison to in Australia. So this setting gives the EL learners opportunities to practice English. Australians are mainly monolingual, and even if they know another language, it is mostly European. So this multicultural setup, whereby the common language is English, directly helps these EL learners to practice the language even more. And even in a normal EL classroom, where students are from all parts, different parts of the world, the common language is English. So they need the language in order to converse with the teachers, with their friends, and to understand the content of the subject. And of course, they also need the language to communicate when they go shopping, when they use the public transport, visit to the doctors, when they're reading the signs and labels and so on. So students, our EL students do realize the importance of learning English. And this has actually given them the reason to keep trying and to allow, and it has allowed maximum opportunity for practice, to practice the language.
Right. Thank you for hanging in there. We are finally there. And just before we go to this, there were some questions that I thought were very, very interesting. Mohammed Sharif, you asked about how can we lower student anxiety in the classroom. So that actually is a really, really good question. And that's a very important question to ask. And for me, especially because I work with a lot of refugee students, they come in with a lot of trauma and they do have a lot of anxiety and trauma, and their trauma can be triggered by the smallest thing. So we even sometimes move away from topics like family, because some of them have lost family members. So we don't do those topics because they trigger. So when students have anxiety, it's very, very important, first of all, to understand what is the trigger for that anxiety, and then work from there. So that if that trigger is because, as you, especially teenagers, your high school students may not want to be to talk in public, for example, they're not ready. So you may want to build that confidence. So always going back to the trigger to help them. And Amin, I think, asked, how do you make students autonomous readers? That is a long process for them to get there. So they need to have a lot of strategies and skills that have to be explicitly taught before they can actually reach that level of autonomous learners. And Connie had a question that says, what about students who cannot write? Connie, I'm not very sure what you mean, because when I say students who cannot write, I literally mean they cannot write ABCD, because they've come from cultures where they are Arabic background, they write right to left and they do not know the alphabet. And or you know, students from Africa, for example, we have students who come from only backgrounds where their entire background do not have written language at all. So they do not even know how to hold a pencil. So I don't know what you mean by students who cannot write. So in my context, cannot write literally means cannot write in English. In your context, I'm assuming they have the letters, but they can't write proper sentences maybe. So then you'll have to put in as many strategies as possible to do that functional grammar kind of thing, to expand the thinking, the sentence, the moving of students. Are there any other questions on the Q&A that we need to address at this point before we move on?
I would like to add something, Bonnie. So yeah. Another strategy that I use to enhance students' engagement, which you would have seen in the instructional strategies, is KWL. So it's also good to know what students want to learn in your subject. So by looking at some of their questions, the questions that they pose, what they want to know, what they want to learn, and then if you have not addressed those questions in your lesson, probably you can address them in the next lesson. And you might be surprised that, you know, students will appreciate that you're actually taking the trouble to answer that questions, and they would then be engaged. Also, what I normally do at the start of each term is give them a survey on just to know what is the whether they are visual learners, kinesthetic learners. So Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, it's very important because we have students different level, different abilities. So sometimes visual might work really, really well with your group. So that would enhance students' engagement. And I've seen this. When you give visuals to learners, it actually creates very rich discussion, rich form of discussion compared to just responding to your questions verbally. And some students are kinesthetic learners. So by changing your lesson methods, by incorporating all this to better suit all your learners, it will indirectly help to increase students' engagement. So give it a go. And yeah.
There is a really good question by Sharmila. You've asked, in cooperative learning, different students are given different roles. If only one student is writing or presenting, how do we assess a student who just holds the presentation material? So when we say different roles, they actually have different roles. Some students may be talking, or one student may be using a dictionary to translate some words. One student might be writing, and one student who is going to present will ask, how is that, which one am I saying first? One student may be the manager. So that's how we do this. So what we're talking about here is not the assessment. We are talking more about the engagement. So when you pull in this shy student, even though they're just holding up presentation material in the first few times, they will slowly begin to gain confidence to work in their group, to work together, to slowly then maybe say, why don't you talk about the first part, and slowly build that confidence. So hope that answers. So in our conclusion, we've got some questions put up here for you. So Sital, you want to go?
Yeah. So we are aware that one size does not fit all, and that the context is different from one country to the other. So having that in mind, we would really like to know, what are some of the positives that you have noticed in the Australian context, the EAL context? Number two, would you be able to use them in the Malaysian context? And
the other countries, Sital?
Yes, sorry, and the other countries, yes.
Yeah.
And number three, what are some of the wonderings you have about this EAL context in Australia?
Yeah, so at this point, maybe if you want to say something, you could raise your hands, and the moderator may be able to unmute one or two candidates so we can actually chat if someone has a question or you want to share something.
So there is a raise hand function at the bottom of your, so if you're interested, you can put up your hands and then we'll allow you to speak here. Okay, we have Muhammad Sharif, who we will allow to talk. So make sure you're,
Yep.
Yeah. So, hi, Muhammad, are you able to try speaking and see? We've allowed you to talk, so are you able to speak right now?
Hello, good morning.
Hi, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. So I would like to talk about the first question. The first question asks what are the positives, some of the positive points that we notice about the Australian English system. One thing, as I noticed from your lecture, that is in Australia there is a very good classification of teaching English. I mean that they provide.
Sorry, Mohammed, you're breaking. I can't really hear you.
Different levels of English for students, for different levels of students. Hello, hear me now?
Can we get him to repeat?
Yes.
There is a problem with the internet connection. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, good.
Okay. Like I mentioned before, I would like to talk about the first question. The positive things that I notice about the Australian language, that Australia classified the English language teaching in a very good way, because they provided very very good levels for different levels of students. I mean, that's for low level, for intermediate, and for advanced students. And also they teach English as a like teaching English for specific purpose. So these are that I noticed about the teaching English in Australia.
Thank you for that feedback, Mohammed.
Hello?
Yes, thank you for your feedback. All right, is there anyone else? Is there anything that you think? Someone has said in the chat that they can be able to use this if they had smaller classrooms, that
Yes.
some of the strategies can be used, which is a good observation. But what you can do is you can have, because what we recommend is groups of students not more than 4. So if you look at Kagan's research, he says not more than 4. That would be the ideal. So what you need to do is create more small groups doing the same thing in your class. And sometimes that I understand there's no space. So instead of moving tables, what we do is we just turn chairs around. So if I'm sitting facing like these 2 students, the students in front just turn their chairs around. Now I have a group of 4. So that's another one. Or take your class outside the classroom. That's another option. So I understand there are many, many ways, but teachers are actually extremely creative. And I think they will come up with ideas. Someone, Erna Deligro, you have said that Australian way is much more personalized as it always tries to address the needs of every student. It's a very good strategy to apply. Yes, thank you. I agree. Yes, and someone says Kagan is really good. All right. So we are going to, are there any other, no one's put up their hand to use, so we're going to leave you with this. Just a poem and a little. Sir Ken Robinson is someone I really admire, so it's a little bit of a quote from him. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to go back to the Q&A and see if there's anything that we can address before we finish up. Vigneswari, you've asked, can we use translation while teaching? That's a really good question. And I know in Malaysia and many Asian countries, they'd say no, but actually that's wrong. You can use translation. And then you get this aha moment from your students. They go, ah, because they now get what you're talking about and you can go on. So yes, definitely we recommend that strategy.
Yeah. Having said that, I would just like to add on, just be mindful not to teach English in Malay language like 100%, but probably translating the instructions so that your students understand what they're required to do. Yes, if the need arises, but we try to use English when we are teaching the language. But yes, if you really feel that the student is stuck and need extra assistance, then of course, translation works. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And Pat, you've asked, is it possible to use cooperative learning and collaborative learning approach in online distance learning? If it is possible, how to do it? It's really actually not, because the students are in their class. But one way you can do things is ask students to have materials ready. If you want them to do some hands-on stuff, that's what I've been able to do. But no cooperative learning or collaborative learning while online. But actually, having said that, I just remembered yesterday I did that with my higher level students, where I actually put them into rooms in the Zoom.
Yep.
I put them into their little rooms and they had to come up with something and then come back and share it with the class. So it is possible if you give them, what do you call that room thing in the Zoom, the little, that you can go into different rooms. Breakout rooms. Yes, you can put them in breakout rooms. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Farida, you've asked, what happened to reading for pleasure? Frequency of seeking will improve. Yes, Malaysian reading habit is pathetic. Actually, the reading habit of a lot of kids has become down, because we may think it's become pathetic because they're not actually physically picking up a book. But a lot of my kids do a lot of their reading on their phone. They're reading other things. So we need to move to reading, from there to reading to what they read things on Instagram, they read things, and so using what they are actually using right now could be a way to get them into reading for pleasure. I think I do that in my classroom.
Yeah.
So we even talk about text languages and all that short words. Yeah.
So getting them to, starting your lesson by just getting them to share what they have recently read on the news could be one of the ways to encourage.
And Stephen Lloyd, you've asked whether I can recommend rubrics on, we can recommend rubrics on criterion-based assessment. It depends on the curriculum you're doing. Your rubrics has to meet the curriculum of wherever you are. And our rubrics may not be, but I'm very happy to share a sample, then you could maybe work from there. Yeah, is there anything else we want to address? In your own experience, how effective is using mother tongue language in teaching English? Very, very, very highly effective. Using the first language to create the hooks that they have, we use the same hooks and then we move those hooks into the new language. Very, very effective. One very good question. Seeing as how there are certain topics that should be avoided in respect to the students' various backgrounds, how do you determine which topic is best to be used in certain classes? Would meetings be conducted? Yes. We have what we call PLCs, professional learning communities. So teachers work in different professional learning communities and we meet once a fortnight or once a week, depending on the school. And we actually continuously talk about topics, continuously talk about our students' well-being, continuously talk about how we can take this back to the classroom for the next lesson.
And discussions are also placed in terms of selecting the text choices. So 3-4 years ago, we introduced a text called Night, which we realized was very, very challenging for our EAL learners because it triggered trauma. So we decided that, okay, we need to change this text because it is actually challenging for our students, not in terms of the language, but it brings back the past experiences and students are not able to engage. So it's through these PLC discussions whereby we reflect on our teaching styles, the text that we choose, and then we then change and select new text so that it suits all learners and it doesn't trigger any form of trauma or it doesn't pose any form of challenges for the students.
And there's a question about, okay, are we stopping? All right, cool.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's
no, that's all right with time,
Yes. Yeah, and time does not permit us to take any more questions. Our speakers have actually addressed most of your questions in the chat box. So thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts to our speakers this afternoon, Bonnie Nathan and Sital Kaur, for your sharing. And I think most of our questions are being addressed. So I hope that everyone is happy and has gained a lot from today's webinar. So thank you to Melta and Oxford Fajar for organizing this webinar. A very big thank you to all the 370 viewers today who joined us from all over the world. So it is truly an insight to know this EAL structure, the pedagogy and the impact on students' learning in the Australian setting. And thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you to everyone. I pass over to, oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, yes. Okay, so basically, I'll just run through a few things before we end. So just remind everyone that, e-certificate will be given within 7 working days via email. So that will be sent out. And just to remind everyone again that this session has been recorded and you are able to access the recorded session in Oxford Fajar and Melta website as well as Facebook pages. Okay, so what we also have here is a QR code for you to scan. You can actually scan this QR code right now to actually fill in the survey questions. Alternatively, the same link will also be given to you tomorrow in our thank you email to you. All right. Hold on, yeah. So we have opened up our registration for the next webinar, which is happening next week. So please register with your full name, as this name will appear in your e-certificate. So we'll just share a little bit. So today we have completed the Australia experience learning. And hold on, yeah. And next one, assessing with confidence, maximizing students' learning outcomes through formative assessment. And then on the 3rd of July, we'll be having the future direction of the pre-university English language education, specifically MUET in Malaysia. So these are the upcoming webinars. So please go to the website to register. All right, so where are they? So basically follow us on our Facebook page, on Oxford Fajar Facebook page, or check us out at www.oxfordfajar.com.my. The same information will also be available on Melta Facebook pages as well as Melta website as well. All right, so just want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ramesh and Yating, as well as Ms. Sital and Ms. Boni. It was such a wonderful experience learning about how really the Australian experience. So just thank you once again.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Boni and Sital, for making the time in preparing for this presentation. I think everyone has benefited a great deal. I like the focus on EAL as a terminology, and I think that last comment which you captured about the use of translation pretty much summarizes the ideological strength of these labels. You know, when you're trained as an ESL teacher, you walk into a classroom thinking there's no place for translation, but then you may end up teaching in a school which is, you know, in a very rural location. And as a second language teacher who has access to the student's native language, that's actually a resource that you should be tapping into. So thank you for highlighting that. So thank you all, and we look forward to you joining us in our next webinar. Bye. And I'd also like to thank Melta Perak for their support, as well as Oxford Fajar, of course. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you, Boni. Thank you, Sital. Thank you,
You're
Dr.
welcome, and thank you for this opportunity. I enjoyed this session. Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you all. Bye.
Bye.